The Tuskegee Experiment. The year is 1972. You're a black sharecropper in Macon County, Alabama, and for the last 4 decades, a man in a white coat has been giving you free medical checkups, free meals, and free burial insurance. You believe you're being treated for, quote, bad blood. You are not. You have syphilis, and the government has known since 1947 that penicillin could cure you. They chose not to give it to you. When a whistleblower finally breaks the story, the U.S. Public Health Service calls it a study. What it was something else entirely. The Tuskegee syphilis study ran from 1932 to 1972. 40 years. It was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service in partnership with the Tuskegee Institute, enrolling 399 black men with latent syphilis and 201 controls. The men were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood, a local term covering multiple ailments. They received no treatment. When penicillin became the standard of care in 1947, the Public Health Service actively worked to ensure participants were excluded from other treatment programs, including World War II draft physicals that would have triggered medical intervention. The study was exposed in 1972 by Associated Press journalist Gene Heller, following a tip from whistleblower Peter Buxton, a former PHS venereal disease investigator who had raised internal objections as early as 1966 and been ignored. By the time the study ended, 28 men had died directly of syphilis. 100 had died of related complications. 40 wives had been infected, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. The government's position, maintained for 4 decades, was that the study was a legitimate observational medical project. Officials argued it was designed to document the natural progression of untreated syphilis in black men, filling a gap in the existing medical literature. The men, the official record held, had consented to participation. The study was framed internally as a contribution to public health science. The consent argument collapses against a single documented fact. The men were never told they had syphilis. They were told they had bad blood and were being treated for it. Informed consent requires, at minimum, that a patient know what they have. Furthermore, PHS officials actively blocked participants from receiving penicillin even as it became freely available. This was not passive observation. It was active medical denial. The specific question the official explanation cannot answer is this: if the study was legitimate science, why did PHS personnel intervene to prevent participants from accessing treatment through entirely separate channels? Why were internal objections raised in 1966 and buried for 6 more years? Who made the specific decision to deny penicillin after 1947? And what justification exists in the internal record? And how many other studies of this design were running simultaneously that we still don't know about? Operation Mockingbird, Washington, D.C., 1953. You're a journalist at a major American newspaper, and you believe you're writing your own stories. You're not entirely wrong, but the source who keeps calling with the best tips, the editor who keeps steering certain angles, the colleague who travels more than his salary should allow, these threads connect somewhere you haven't looked. Somewhere inside Langley, a man with a budget and a list of your colleagues' names is reading tomorrow's headlines before they're written. Operation Mockingbird was a CIA program initiated in the early 1950s under Director Allen Dulles and overseen by Frank Wisner, then head of the Office of Policy Coordination. The program recruited American journalists, editors, and media executives to publish CIA-approved content, suppress stories damaging to U.S. intelligence interests, and shape domestic and foreign public opinion. Its existence was flatly denied by the CIA for over 2 decades. It was partially confirmed in 1975 through the Church Committee, the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, which documented that by the early 1970s, the CIA maintained relationships with approximately 400 American journalists. Senator Frank Church's final report noted that the CIA had at various times owned or subsidized more than 50 newspapers, wire services, and magazines globally. Internal CIA documents, declassified in 1977, confirmed that major American news organizations had witting participants at senior editorial levels. The specific operational budget for domestic media influence has never been fully disclosed. The official position, maintained from the program's inception through the mid-1970s, was categorical. The CIA did not operate domestically, did not recruit American journalists, and did not interfere with the free press. CIA Director William Colby, testifying before Congress in 1973, acknowledged only limited foreign press relationships. Domestic influence operations, the official record held, were outside the CIA's legal mandate under the 1947 National Security Act. The Church Committee findings directly contradict this position, not with theory, but with names, organizations, and budget lines. What the official explanation cannot reconcile is the 400-journalist figure. These were not foreign nationals or foreign-based correspondents. These were domestic reporters operating inside American newsrooms. The specific question that remains unanswered is this. The Church Committee documented the relationships, but did not publish the names. Those names are still classified. 50 years later, the American public cannot verify which news organizations were compromised during the period when the press was simultaneously covering Vietnam, civil rights, and Watergate. Which stories were killed? Which sources were manufactured? And why, 5 decades later, are the journalist recruitment files still classified rather than released? MKUltra, Montreal, 1957. You were a patient at the Allen Memorial Institute, admitted for mild depression. Dr. Ewan Cameron, a man who will one day serve as president of both the American and World Psychiatric Associations, has a treatment plan for you. It involves drug-induced sleep for weeks at a time, electroconvulsive therapy at voltages 30 to 40 times the normal therapeutic dose, and recorded messages played on loop during unconsciousness. A technique Cameron calls psychic driving. You will leave with no memory of who you were before you arrived. The CIA is paying the bill, and it will deny this for 20 years. MKUltra was a covert CIA research program, formally approved by Director Allen Dulles on April 13, 1953. It ran until at least 1973 and encompassed 150 sub-projects conducted at 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies. The program investigated mind control, behavior modification, and chemical interrogation using LSD, barbiturates, mescaline, and other substances, often administered to unwitting subjects including CIA employees, military personnel, prisoners, and psychiatric patients. It was categorically denied until 1975, when the Rockefeller Commission investigation into CIA domestic activities revealed its existence. In 1977, a Freedom of Information Act request uncovered approximately 20,000 documents that CIA Director Richard Helms had failed to destroy in 1973 when he ordered MKUltra records purged. They had been misfiled in a financial records building. Senate hearings that year, led by Senator Ted Kennedy, established the program's scope. Dr. Cameron's work at McGill University was later the subject of successful lawsuits by Canadian victims, with the Canadian government paying $100,000 Canadian dollars in compensation to survivors in 1992. The official position before 1975 was absolute denial. CIA representatives testified before Congress that no domestic behavior modification programs existed. The destruction of records in 1973 was itself an official act. Director Helms ordered the purge specifically to prevent congressional oversight, suggesting the denial was not passive but actively maintained. The 20,000 surviving documents exist only because of a filing error. The official explanation for MKUltra's termination is that it was discontinued in 1973 when it became clear results were inconclusive. But the record destruction happened before the program was ever publicly known, which means the termination and the cover-up were simultaneous decisions, not sequential ones. The specific question the official record cannot answer is this. The 1977 documents represent a fraction of what was ordered destroyed. What was in the files that were successfully purged? How many unwitting subjects were dosed and never identified? How many of Cameron's patients lost memories that were never restored? And which of MKUltra's 150 sub-projects have never appeared in any declassified document? The Gulf of Tonkin. August 4, 1964. You're aboard the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, and your captain is sending urgent cables to Washington, reporting a second North Vietnamese torpedo attack. The cables will reach Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara within hours. President Johnson will use them to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress in 48 hours, a resolution that gives him authority to escalate military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The attack your captain is reporting almost certainly never happened. 3 million people will die in the war it authorizes. The Gulf of Tonkin incident has two parts. The first, on August 2, 1964, was real. North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox in international waters. The second, on August 4th, was not. Captain John Herrick, commanding the Maddox, sent a follow-up cable to Washington hours after reporting the second attack, stating, "Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedoes fired appear doubtful. Freak weather effects on radar and overeager sonar men may have accounted for many reports. No actual visual sightings by Maddox. Suggest complete evaluation before any action." This cable was received by McNamara. Johnson delivered his address to the nation requesting congressional authorization the same evening. The National Security Agency's own classified study, completed in 2001 and declassified in 2005, concluded that the August 4th attack did not occur. NSA historian Robert Hanyuk wrote that intelligence officials had manipulated the evidence, presenting Johnson with a version of the signal's intelligence that supported the attack narrative while suppressing data that contradicted it. The official position maintained from 1964 through the early 1990s was that both attacks occurred, and that the military response was proportionate and justified. McNamara defended the Gulf of Tonkin resolution before Congress with certainty. The second attack was presented as established fact. Herrick's cable existed in the official record from August 4, 1964 onward. McNamara received it before Johnson's address. The NSA study does not suggest intelligence failure. It documents deliberate manipulation. The specific question the official explanation cannot answer is this. If McNamara received Herrick's retraction cable before the congressional address, who made the decision to proceed, and on what basis was the contradicting intelligence classified for 41 years? Was the resolution passed on evidence that senior officials already doubted? Which other military authorizations in the subsequent decade relied on intelligence manufactured by the same process? And who, specifically, altered the signal's intelligence summary that reached the president? Agent Orange. Da Nang, Vietnam, 1967. U.S. Air Force cargo planes are dispensing a fine mist across the jungle canopy below. A defoliant the military calls tactical herbicide. Catalog designation Agent Orange. The pilots have been told it is harmless to humans. The soldiers moving through the jungle below have been told the same. Dow Chemical and Monsanto, the primary manufacturers, have internal research suggesting otherwise. The Department of Defense will repeat the harmlessness claim for the next 15 years, while veterans come home and start dying in unfamiliar ways. Agent Orange was a 50-50 mixture of two herbicides, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, with the manufacturing byproduct TCDD dioxin, one of the most toxic compounds known to science, present as a contaminant. Between 1961 and 1971, the U.S. military sprayed approximately 11 million gallons of Agent Orange across 4.5 million acres of Vietnam under Operation Ranch Hand. The Department of Defense maintained for over a decade that the compound posed no significant health risk to humans. Internal documents later obtained through litigation revealed that Dow chemical scientists had identified the dioxin contamination and its potential toxicity as early as 1965 and had communicated this to government contractors. In 1984, 7 chemical companies settled a class action lawsuit brought by Vietnam veterans for $180 million. At the time, the largest settlement of its kind, without admitting liability. The Department of Veterans Affairs did not formally acknowledge a service connection between Agent Orange exposure and specific diseases until 1991 with the Agent Orange Act, 20 years after spraying ended. The VA's own internal studies from the late 1970s, obtained through FOIA requests, showed elevated rates of soft tissue sarcoma and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in exposed veterans years before official acknowledgement. The official position from 1961 through the mid-1980s was consistent. Agent Orange posed no long-term health risk to personnel. Military spokespeople cited the herbicide's approved agricultural use as evidence of safety. The dioxin contamination was acknowledged only after litigation forced internal documents into the public record. The VA's own internal studies predate the official acknowledgement by more than a decade. The government was generating evidence of harm internally while publicly denying it externally. The specific, unanswerable question is this. The 1965 Dow communication to government contractors documented the dioxin hazard 4 years before spraying ended. Who received that communication, and what decision was made in response? How many veterans filed disability claims for Agent Orange-related conditions and were denied during the 20-year period between exposure and official acknowledgement? And what is the current health status of Vietnamese civilians in the highest exposure zones, where dioxin levels in soil still exceed international safety thresholds by a factor of 400? COINTELPRO, Chicago, December 4th, 1969. It is 4 a.m. 14 Chicago police officers, acting on a floor plan provided by an FBI informant, raid an apartment on Monroe Street. Black Panther Party Chairman Fred Hampton is asleep. He is 21 years old. He will be shot twice in the head at close range and will never wake up. The FBI's internal memo describing the raid will call it a success. For 7 years, the Bureau will deny it had any involvement in what happened that morning. COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, ran formally from 1956 to 1971, targeting domestic political organizations the Bureau deemed subversive. Targets included the Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, the Ku Klux Klan, the American Indian Movement, and the Black Panther Party. The program used infiltration, forged documents, fabricated correspondence designed to provoke internal conflict, anonymous letters to family members of targets, and coordination with local law enforcement for raids and prosecutions. Its existence was entirely unknown to the public until March 1971, when a group called the Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into the FBI field office in Media, Pennsylvania, and removed approximately 1,000 documents, selectively releasing them to journalists. Director J. Edgar Hoover denied the program's existence until the files were physically in reporters' hands. The Church Committee's 1975 investigation documented 2,218 separate COINTELPRO actions. In the Hampton case specifically, a 1976 civil suit established that the FBI had provided the floor plan of Hampton's apartment to the Chicago Police Department, and that the informant, William O'Neill, had drugged Hampton with secobarbital the night before the raid, a fact confirmed by a medical examiner's toxicology report. The Bureau's official position was categorical denial of any coordination in Hampton's death, and denial of COINTELPRO's existence, until the media documents made denial impossible. Director Hoover characterized COINTELPRO operations as standard domestic security work when forced to acknowledge them. The secobarbital finding is the detail that forecloses the coordination denial. Hampton was drugged the night before a pre-dawn raid. His informant had access to his food or drink. The floor plan was delivered to police. These are sequential, coordinated acts, not coincidences. The unanswerable question is this. The Church Committee documented 2,218 COINTELPRO actions. How many produced outcomes similar to December 4, 1969, and were never examined because the target survived or the evidence was less traceable? Which active political movements between 1971 and today have been subject to equivalent programs operating under different designations? And who authorized the secobarbital, the CIA and crack cocaine? South Central Los Angeles, 1986. A crack cocaine epidemic is detonating through the neighborhood with a speed that bewilders law enforcement and devastates families. Journalist Gary Webb is not yet watching. That will come later. What is already happening in airstrips in Central America and in warehouses in California is a supply chain that connects Nicaraguan Contra rebels, a CIA asset named Norwin Meneses, and a distribution network that feeds directly into the streets of Los Angeles. When Webb publishes his findings in 1996, the government's response will not be investigation. It will be destruction of Webb, not of the story. Gary Webb's 1996 Dark Alliance series in the San Jose Mercury News documented a specific supply chain. Ricky Ross, the dominant crack distributor in Los Angeles during the 1980s, sourced his cocaine from Blandon and Meneses, Nicaraguan nationals with documented ties to the CIA-backed Contra network. Internal CIA Inspector General Frederick Hitz's investigation, completed in 1998, acknowledged that the CIA had been aware of drug trafficking by Contra supporters and had failed to report it to the Justice Department as required by law. The report covered the years 1982 to 1995 and confirmed that the CIA had maintained relationships with individuals and organizations known to be involved in drug trafficking, prioritizing Contra operational support over drug enforcement reporting obligations. A 1989 Senate subcommittee report by Senator John Kerry, largely ignored at the time of its publication, had already documented drug money flowing through Contra networks with the knowledge of senior U.S. officials. Webb died in 2004 from 2 gunshot wounds to the head. The coroner ruled it a suicide. The official response to Webb's series was coordinated discrediting. The CIA, the Los Angeles Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times each published critical pieces challenging Webb's reporting within weeks of publication. The CIA's own spokesperson stated that the agency had no involvement in drug trafficking into the United States. The Hitz Inspector General report, an internal CIA document, confirmed the core of what Webb reported. Not that the CIA directly shipped cocaine, but that it knowingly maintained relationships with traffickers and suppressed that information from law enforcement. The discrediting campaign preceded the internal investigation. The specific question is this. If the internal investigation ultimately confirmed CIA awareness of trafficking in its own network, on what basis were the 1996 denials issued, and who authorized them? Who at the Justice Department received and filed the non-reports the CIA was legally required to submit? And what was in the portion of the Hitz report that remains classified to this day? Warrantless mass surveillance. Fort Meade, Maryland, 2002. Inside a building with no name on any public map, analysts at the National Security Agency are reading your emails. Not because you are a suspect, not because a judge has reviewed your communications and found probable cause, because a secret presidential directive signed after September 11 has authorized the collection of domestic electronic communications on a scale the NSA's own lawyers initially called illegal. For the next 11 years, every senior official asked directly whether such a program exists will say no. Some of them will be under oath. The NSA's warrantless surveillance program, initially designated Stellarwind and later expanded under multiple codenames, was authorized by President George W. Bush in October 2001 through a secret executive order bypassing the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. The program collected metadata and content from domestic telephone and internet communications. On March 12, 2013, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper was asked directly by Senator Ron Wyden during a Senate Intelligence Committee hearing. Does the NSA collect any type of data at all on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? Clapper answered, "No, sir." 3 months later, Edward Snowden released classified NSA documents to journalists Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. The documents revealed that the NSA's PRISM program collected communications data from Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Apple, and 5 other major technology companies, and that the Boundless Informant program had recorded over 97 billion internet data records and 124 billion telephone records in a single 30-day period in March 2013. Clapper subsequently described his answer to Wyden as the least untruthful response he could give in an open setting. No charges were filed. The official position from 2001 through June 2013 was consistent categorical denial. Multiple NSA directors, attorneys general, and intelligence officials testified or publicly stated that domestic mass surveillance did not occur. Clapper's least untruthful formulation is the precise moment where the official denial framework reveals its architecture. He was not confused. He was not mistaken. He knew the true answer and calculated a false one. He said this publicly, after the fact, without legal consequence. The specific question is this. Wyden had been briefed on the program as a member of the Intelligence Committee. He knew what the true answer was when he asked the question. The exchange was therefore a documented, orchestrated public lie, on the record, before Congress. What is the legal framework under which a director of national intelligence can lie to the Senate and face no consequence? How many other direct questions asked by cleared senators in open hearings between 2001 and 2013 received similarly constructed false answers? And what programs currently operating under the same legal architecture remain unknown because no Snowden has yet walked out the door? The Radium Girls and Industrial Poisoning. Orange, New Jersey, 1917. You were a young woman painting watch dials at the United States Radium Corporation. Your supervisor has taught you to point your brush with your lips, tip, dip, paint, because it produces the finest lines. The radium paint glows. You and your coworkers paint your nails with it, your faces, your teeth, laughing in the dark of the bathroom. The company's own physicists, working in a separate building, wear lead aprons and use lead screens when handling the same material. When you start losing your teeth in 1922, the company's physician will tell you it's syphilis. The United States Radium Corporation employed approximately 4,000 women as dial painters between 1917 and 1926 across facilities in New Jersey and Illinois. By the early 1920s, workers were presenting with severe anemia, jawbone necrosis, and skeletal fractures. Company physician Dr. Frederick Flynn, hired to evaluate workers' health, was not a licensed physician. He was a physiologist on corporate retainer whose medical degree was later disputed. His examinations found workers to be in excellent health. The company's position, maintained from 1922 through 1928, was that radium ingestion posed no health risk and that the workers' conditions stemmed from other causes including syphilis, a diagnosis that served to stigmatize rather than treat. In 1925, Dr. Cecil Drinker of Harvard University conducted an independent study that found severe radium poisoning among the workers. The United States Radium Corporation initially suppressed and then attempted to alter Drinker's report before publication. In 1927, 5 workers, known collectively as the Radium Girls, filed suit. Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and 2 others were by then unable to walk. Their bones were fracturing spontaneously. Their jaws had been surgically removed. The 1928 settlement established medical monitoring rights and compensation, representing one of the first successful occupational health lawsuits in American history, and laying the legal groundwork for worker safety regulation. The corporate denial that their illness was work-related had been maintained for 6 years while workers continued to die. The official corporate position, supported by company-retained medical opinion, was that radium ingestion at the levels experienced by dial painters posed no documented health risk, and that the workers' conditions were attributable to other causes. The lead aprons worn by company physicists in the same facility are the detail that cannot be reconciled. The corporation had implemented protective protocols for its scientists before its workers ever began showing symptoms. Protection existed. It was withheld. The specific question is this: who made the decision that floor workers would not receive equivalent protection? And is that decision documented in the corporate record? How many other industrial compounds currently classified as safe have internal corporate research from the past 3 decades suggesting otherwise? And how many of the legal frameworks designed to prevent what happened to the Radium girls have since been quietly amended through regulatory rollback? The leaded gasoline cover-up. Dayton, Ohio, December 9, 1921. A chemist named Thomas Midgley Jr., working in a General Motors research laboratory, has just discovered that tetraethyl lead eliminates engine knock in automobiles. He knows it is toxic. He will himself develop lead poisoning from laboratory exposure within 3 years. His employer, General Motors, and Standard Oil know it too. They also know that a non-toxic alternative, ethanol, works just as well. The decision made in the next 24 months to go with lead will quietly lower the IQ of every child born in the developed world for the next 5 decades. The cover-up will be so total that the scientist who finally proves the harm will not be a toxicologist. He will be a geologist, because the only place the evidence is still clean is in the ice. Tetraethyl lead, TEL, was added to gasoline beginning in 1923 by a joint venture of Standard Oil, General Motors, and DuPont, operating as the Ethyl Corporation. At a 1925 U.S. Public Health Service conference convened to evaluate TEL safety, Dr. Alice Hamilton of Harvard Medical School and other public health researchers argued that lead's neurotoxicity was documented and cumulative. The Ethyl Corporation's representatives, including Midgley, argued there was no practical alternative and no evidence of public harm at ambient exposure levels. The Public Health Service issued a report that year recommending further study but not prohibition, effectively clearing TEL for continued use. In 1965, geochemist Claire Patterson at Caltech published research comparing lead levels in ancient Arctic ice cores against modern samples, demonstrating that atmospheric lead had increased 1,000-fold since the industrial era, and that what had been classified as the normal blood lead level in Americans was in fact a contaminated baseline. There was no pre-industrial comparison group left on Earth's surface. The Ethyl Corporation lobbied to have Patterson removed from National Research Council committees and pressured Caltech to terminate his funding. Efforts documented in Patterson's own testimony and confirmed by subsequent researchers. Leaded gasoline was not fully phased out in the United States until 1996, 73 years after its introduction. A 2022 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences estimated that childhood lead exposure from gasoline between the 1940s and 1980s reduced the average American IQ by 2.6 points, with the highest exposure cohorts losing more than 6 points, representing, in aggregate, hundreds of millions of IQ points across the population. The official position, maintained by the Ethyl Corporation and supported by captured federal regulatory processes from 1923 to the late 1970s, was that ambient lead exposure from gasoline combustion posed no measurable neurological risk to the public. Industry-funded research consistently found insufficient evidence of harm. Regulatory bodies accepted this framing for 5 decades. Patterson did not work with human subjects or epidemiological studies. He worked with ice. The lead was in the ice, in amounts that existed nowhere on Earth before 1923. And the ice did not have a lobbying budget. The specific question that has never received a satisfactory official answer is this. The 1925 Public Health Service Conference had access to decades of industrial lead toxicology. The neurotoxicity of lead at high doses was not in dispute. What specific evidentiary standard was applied that separated high-dose harm from ambient dose safety, and who designed that standard? How many regulatory approvals between 1940 and 1980 used the contaminated lead baseline? The one Patterson proved was not a baseline at all, as their reference point for acceptable exposure. And if the aggregate IQ loss across the exposed generation is now calculable, what decisions were made by the people who grew up with the highest blood lead levels? And can those decisions be meaningfully separated from the neurotoxic environment in which they were made?